Hello there, I'm Callum and welcome to the EU in Review, where I review the Star Wars Expanded Universe as I experience it. And this time I'm going to be talking about the
epic crossover event, Lost in Time,
which is the Droids issue number 4 and Ewoks issue number 10, which is awesome. They're written by David Manek and illustrated by John Romita and Warren Creamer. So both of the artists from the Droids comic line and from the Ewoks comic line have come together, which is actually pretty cool. Thoughts on the plot? I thought the idea was interesting, and it's definitely really cool to have a crossover event between the Droids and Ewoks comics and bring that to fruition. The overall plot on paper looks alright. It's still a kid's storyline. And so you get some of that in it, as with the dialogue as well. That's the main thing I say, is a lot of it's for kids. Overall, it's actually pretty interesting, and it's really ambitious for this early on in Star Wars' lifespan as well, to do a crossover like this between the two comic lines, with an idea like time travel. Inevitably, it's going to get mentioned. Lost in Time is a title, you can guess what it means. Anyway. The writing style, again, is very much kids. Pacing is actually pretty good. I think the pacing's about right for a comic, even though it's for kids and that. It pushes the plot along fairly well and doesn't hang things up too much, but it explains what it needs to, so that's the main thing. And what's really cool about the art is that it's got the Droids art style and the Ewoks art style, very much like the two cartoons, of course, that the comics are based on. And they sort of meld them together because both of the different illustrators were working on it. And they do very well at blending it together and having them interact with each other. I will say though, that the one thing for this is continuity. And there's some interesting pieces of continuity I'll mention later on in this spoiler section. But for now, I'll say the continuity is quite interesting and sort of builds upon one of my theories from the previous Droids review. So, without further ado, I will get to these interesting notes that I took as I read them. So, Droids issue 4. The Droids and Ewoks are
Lost in Time.
Somehow the droids are diplomatic couriers, because they didn't really explain how they got to that point, because the Droids comics jump a bit. And there's cricket or ant people, somehow. That was funny. And another funny thing is that Prince Pluse is King Goku's son. It just could also be a Dragon Ball reference with King Goku, I'm not sure. Also, Goku and his men seem like a frog toad species, which I thought was interesting. They don't really explain what these species are at all, they're just randomly there. And somehow, by Pluse messing with the antimatter in the hyperdrive, apparently the hyperdrive relies on antimatter, they travelled 100 years into the future. It's just crazy, it's like, what? This suddenly happened? But then that confirms one of my theories from the previous Droid review, where I was saying that they must be set before the Phantom Menace. And it is, because 100 years before the Ewoks comics would place it before the Phantom Menace. And so that gives it time to be able to have 3PO destroyed and then rebuilt by Anakin in Phantom Menace a little bit earlier, of course. And I'm not sure about R2, but I assume that he gets destroyed and refurbished and they use the numbers again, because of course they obviously call them that. And then part 2 is
Escape to Endor.
Apparently the escape pod crashes on Endor and the Ewoks are having a peace treaty with the Droids on the same day. You go, coincidence? I think not. Anyway, the Ewoks first think 3PO and R2 are demons, which is quite the opposite of Return of the Jedi. More on that a little bit later. And it leaves a cliffhanger into the Ewoks comic, which is actually nice because it really builds the bridge between them and connects the story together. And I love, again, how the artists came together to do a combined effort on each of the panels in this crossover. And then issue 10 of the Ewoks comics, which is Ewoks and Droids in
The Demons of Endor.
It's cool how they do the crossover, of course. And the intro says that they get caught in a time warp. So let's do the time warp again. I can't do it properly in my chair, but you get it. R2 does some crazy things, like stopping a big boulder with his legs. Like, it shifts, R2 shifts his legs facing upwards, and then the boulder crashes down on top of it and it stops it. And I'm like, what? How are you not destroyed? But it's like, it looks like a hydraulic cylinder when he's in that position, which is funny. I think it's funny that Plu's got stuck in the Ewok honey. And it's interesting that they do explain that 3PO can speak the language, and he establishes it as an obscure dialect from the Inazuma region. Which, if we go back to he was around before the Phantom Menace, if his memory was wiped, he would have no idea that he already sorted out the language of the Ewoks. And so he just reinterpreted it in Return of the Jedi. And that's something I love about the EU, is these different interpretations you can get of the movies from each of the stories told. And, yes, this part. 3PO scares the Droids off from the sun's rays bouncing from his shell. And they think he's a demon and run off and all that. What I really thought this moment reminded me of, and what was really cool, is how it explains why the Ewoks think 3PO is a god. Because in this, he very much protected the Ewoks and he used some mysterious power that they didn't know about, which is just reflection. But anyway, makes sense for a primitive species not to understand it. And despite them thinking there's a demon, he protected them. They go, oh, he must be a deity, and that's how they tell the story to their kids and everything, and that's what they believe. And then when 3PO comes back in Return of the Jedi, they're like, God's returned, yes! Let's offer up meat for him. Because all gods eat meat. But anyway, part 2 of the Ewoks portion of this crossover is a race in time. And so they go back to the time, the way that they got there. So when Plu's messed with the antimatter, created some wormhole thing that they went through, and they got transported 100 years in the future. And so before the wormhole closes, they go back through it. And this is the first instance of time travel both ways in Star Wars, which is quite interesting. R2 uses the weapon, which I've actually never seen R2 use a lethal weapon before, and realistically, wouldn't it be restricted by programming? I think too much about things sometimes. And of course it's resolved when they return Plu's an exposed slud, so they had this whole subplot of this slud was attacking you and sent Plu's to be captured so that King Goku would start a war and whatever. Which is much of a muchness. We more care about the time travel, don't we? Because damn, it's like, okay, here's a crossover, here's time travel, let's do this. Which is actually a very interesting idea, and it's interesting that they implemented it. But I am glad that this isn't 100% in the C-canon continuity. Because of course this is made for kids, so just for fun, and a lot of the other issues in the Droids and Ewoks don't seem to line up quite as much as they should. But these were made when Marvel was in charge of the comics, and before 1991, this is 1986, and so they didn't pay as much attention to continuity and went, oh, this is a cool story, let's just tell it. So it's a very interesting idea, and it's cool that this is a crossover event between Droids and Ewoks, which I thought was really awesome, because I didn't expect that to happen. When I was reading through this, I was like, okay, I'll read the Droids comics after I read the Ewoks comics. And then I've read more of the Marvel comics, and then I only have Return of the Jedi, I think, to go, because that's not in the main Marvel run. I think, no, this completely surprised me. It went, what? There's a Ewoks comic with the droids in it, so I need to go back and read the Droids comics, because it said that it goes from issue 4 of Droids. I'm like, whoa, that's cool. I love how they were ambitious and took risks with that. But anyway, fun story, still kiddie, but actually really cool to read. I really enjoyed this. So thank you guys so much for watching this. Hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts. What are your thoughts on this
Epic crossover event. Lost in time.
Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video. Reivew.